Tanse, Tawau, welcome everyone. This is our first decolonizing session of 2023, and I'm grateful to be joining from Sacred Buffalo Guardian Mountain here on the Banff Centre on Treaty 7 territory. So my name is Janine Windolf. I'm the Director of Indigenous Arts, but I came here 3 years ago as the Associate Director with my two sons, Delari and Corwin. A little bit about my background. I am Woodland Cree from La Ronge, Saskatchewan, so Treaty 6 area, but I'm a descendant of a missing woman who came from Waswanipi Cree Nation, so I'm a member of the James Bay Agreement, and I have a home in Treaty 4 as well as a home here in Treaty 7. So it's my honor to welcome Ian Cusson, who I met in, I do believe, 2020 near, was it kind of December, with the online opera program, which was a really unique experience for me, but I definitely made some wonderful connections. And following, I don't know how many sessions, there was 2 more components to it. And then eventually in 2021, I was able to catch the group in person and take in my very first opera experience. So welcome, Ian, and I look forward to listening in today and our conversation tomorrow.
Thank you so much for having me, Janine, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. It's just a real pleasure to get to share a little bit about myself, about my work, and to weigh in on this huge topic. So a little bit about me, who I am, where I'm from, and who I'm from. My name again is Ian Cusson, and I come from a small community called Midland, Ontario. It's actually kind of like a trifecta of 3 communities that are part of Georgian Bay, which is a bay off of Lake Huron in Ontario. And the community that I'm from is quite unique, or at least the bit of land, because it's made up of 3 different groups of people primarily. There's a First Nations community, an Ojibwe community there. There's a French settler community that came in the late 19th century. And then there's a Métis community, which is what I'm part of on my mother's side, and French Canadian on my father's side. So the Métis community was actually founded in, started in this particular area in about 1830. We actually lived in another area called Drummond Island, and then that area was ceded to the Americans, and our families moved across the waterways that we'd been using for a lot of years and settled in the Penetanguishene area, and still live there to this day. My family, some of whom are joining us tonight, are still there. I'm a member of the Georgian Bay Métis Community, which is part of the Métis Nation of Ontario. And I live currently in, and I'm calling in from Treaty 14 area, which is Oakville, Ontario, where I live with my wife and 4 kids. So my particular practice is as a composer. I have the great privilege of getting to work with all kinds of interesting artists and thinkers and musicians and arts makers. And what I actually make primarily is operatic work. So I am an opera composer. I'm also a composer of orchestral music. I'm a composer of song. And it's interesting to think about when I think about myself, coming from this small community where classical music for sure was not a huge part of what people talked about or what people did. And for sure, opera was not a big part of what anybody knew about, or at least what anybody told me about. But as I look back at my childhood and I look back at my upbringing, it makes a lot of sense that I do the work that I do, in particular, writing operas. And I think what is unique about creating operatic work is a couple of things. It's primarily a form of storytelling. And I think of one of my grandmothers in particular, who was a storyteller that had such a deep impact on my own childhood and my upbringing. I would sit at her house. I would sometimes play hooky from school. I got ill often. And I'd go to her house because she lived right beside the school, and she would fill me with stories that she came out of this incredible imagination of hers, all afternoon while I had tea and sat with her and had cookies. So it's really kind of in my DNA and in my blood to be a part of telling stories. Opera is kind of this medium that brings together the most exciting parts of the artistic performing arts world, in that it brings together theater, all that comes with that. So costume design, lighting design, set design. It brings together music, of course, which is the really primary vehicle for telling story, using music. And that can include an orchestra sometimes. That might have 100 musicians in it. It also includes singers that have this particular training that is, these incredible voices that can really become their own amplifiers. And it includes just all of the sort of stage magic that goes with that. And so for me, coming to opera as an adult makes a lot of sense, because as a kid, it really lines up with that sort of storytelling tradition that I come from. I was first introduced to opera when I was I must have been about 10 years old or so. Had a couple of music teachers in my community that of course taught like the classical method and the Royal Conservatory method of teaching, but they were also very eager to sort of show me what was possible in music. And they would send me home with CDs, with records, with tapes of some of the most interesting world musics that were available. I remember having a recording of The Mystery of the Bulgarian Voice, or Mystère des Voix Bulgares, which was an album, I think, in the late 80s. And it was Bulgarian women's choirs. And I thought, oh my gosh, this is a sound world that I've never really heard. I had these teachers would often send me home with recordings of operas as well. So I heard a Peter Grimes by Benjamin Britten, and I fell in love with the storytelling and the epic scale of the storytelling. So I was hooked quite intensely from a really young age. Another thing that really appeals to me about opera, as I think about why opera, why do I make this work, is really because of the voice. I mentioned a bit before that that opera singer training allows the musician to be their own amplifier. So they were able to kind of use the various spaces of the body, the structures of the face, the support mechanism and the breath to be able to project their voices, sometimes over 100 plus players in an orchestra, which is no small feat. But I think that what really excites me about singers, and why I've always been drawn to them, in fact, I married a singer, but I've been fascinated with singers probably for a number of reasons. One, maybe because I always wished I was a singer. I sang a lot as a young child. But more than that, I think because of the very personal nature of the voice. The voice, the instrument of the voice, is what you are born with. Of course, we can train our voices and that sort of thing. But I liken it to if you played like a clarinet or an oboe or a trumpet, that instrument is outside of your own body. So if you choose a different instrument or made out of a different material, you'll get a different sound. With the voice, it is the body that you have. And so the sound or the color or the texture or the density, all of the pieces that make up a particular human voice depends on your own body. And so there's something very personal about singing. And when I was in music school in my late teens and early 20s in Toronto, I remember always being drawn to the singers because they were often the most interesting people, often with the most exciting personalities, but really with this personal connection to their instrument. What I thought would be interesting for this time of talking tonight would not just be to talk, but to play a couple of examples of my work. And while I'm going to spend most of my time today talking about opera and operatic work, I wanted to share a little excerpt from a song cycle. So this would be a collection of songs, often called art song, which is just basically not pop songs. This collection of songs in particular was written this past year and premiered by the Vancouver Symphony and also by the Victoria Symphony. And when I got this commission to write these songs, I asked if I could, well, first of all, if I could write songs. I love always working with the voice, as I said. But then the second question was, could I set text by Joy Harjo? Joy Harjo is a Muskogee poet from the US, and she is the first Indigenous US poet laureate. And I think she's in maybe her second term of that title. She has written for over 50 years. She's also a jazz musician, but her texts are some of the most sublime, incredible, moving words that really have inspired me for a couple of years since I've known her work. And so this song cycle is a collection of 3 of her songs called Songs from the House of Death. And we're going to listen to the second in the cycle. The song is called I'm a Dangerous Woman. And we'll play it, and then I'll come back and talk a little bit about it. Great. Thank you so much for that. So again, this is one of the cool things I get to do is get to play with that volume of sound or that amount of sound and color. This piece was really important because it was a collaboration with the singer Christina Szabo that we saw there. And it was a chance for both of us to really spend a lot of time in Joy Harjo's complete work and read through everything she'd written and come together to say what were the poems that really spoke deeply to us. And this was one of the ones that she offered. And I thought, well, it's just a kick-ass title, I Am a Dangerous Woman. In fact, I dedicated the whole cycle to the dangerous women in my life. That is, and of course, we're saying dangerous women in the tongue-in-cheek kind of way, right? The strong matriarchal women who have often had to stand up to a lot of things and deal with quite a lot of pushback, oppression, and have done so with this incredible resilience and dignity. It's amazing. And so that was sort of my love letter to those women, who are many in my life. And one of the things I should say in writing songs, even though the bulk of my work is opera, I've really been drawn to interesting voices, of which there are so many, in particular female voices. And I've really tried to center most of my songwriting on texts by Indigenous women. I've been able to set texts by Katharina Vermette, who is an incredible Métis novelist and poet. I've set text by Marilyn Dumont. In fact, just recently, a choral work on her poem, Will I Night? And I've also set a cycle of songs of hers. And who else? Of course, Joy Harjo here, and Cherie Dimmeline, and I'll talk a little bit about Cherie in a couple minutes. So really important to me to get to set awesome, empowered, exciting voices. And again, for me, it's about bringing words and texts and sounds that are not typically found in the concert hall to these exciting works and to audiences that can kind of discover and meet these great texts. So thinking of the title a little bit of this talk, this idea of a decolonial practice, or I'll call it anti-colonial practice in opera. There's a couple of things that I was thinking about as to what makes for anti-colonial work in opera. And firstly, what I would say is that anti-colonial work is, I think, in any space, very, very difficult, or can be very difficult. And one thing I was reflecting on as I was preparing for this time today was how difficult it can be, especially as the size of organization increases. Someone, I think it was Yvette Nolan, a director, dramaturge, librettist friend, was saying that to turn a ship, if you have a little boat in the water and you want to make a 180-degree turn, it's pretty easy to do that. You can do that without much radius. But if you're in a ship, like a steamboat, or like an enormous boat, you're in the Titanic, right? To turn the ship around takes much wider radius. It takes more time. You have to do it with more patience and delicacy sometimes. And I think that with larger organizations, while I think the public stage for anti-colonial work can be much bigger and that work gets more notice, it can be much harder to do on a very nuts and bolts practical level, and not, I should say, often for a lack of wanting to do that from leadership, but rather just from the complexity of the organization and the organism that they're working with. And a little bit more on that as I go through. But I think key elements to decolonial work, I think it comes down to the stories that we tell, the stories that we put on our stages. And in the example of the songs that I just played, or the song I played, it's the poets, the voices that occupy those spaces. What stories are being told there. That's the first thing. I think also the people who tell the stories. There's a tradition in Canada and around the world of telling stories that are from completely outside of the cultural milieu of the story itself. And that isn't wholly wrong, I don't think, but I think there is a particular vantage that a person from a particular lived experience can bring when the material is specific to their community or their culture. So having a bigger diversity of people telling stories and telling new stories and making new work, I think is really important, and a part of anti-colonial work. And then I think the last thing for me, or at least another thing I'll offer, is the way we go about making the work. So I think there are traditional practices within classical space. Again, opera, classical music is from a very Eurocentric tradition that has all kinds of particular customs and habits that often go unquestioned and even unacknowledged, like it's just a normal way of working. If you think of an orchestra, how an orchestra is managed, how a hierarchical structure works within an orchestra. And if you were to say, could we try it a little differently? Often there is it can be met with a lot of skepticism. It can be met with a sense of like, but that's not how we do this. And so you can get that kind of resistance. But I think there is a path forward and an interesting path with how we go about making work. Little bit about the stories that we tell. And I'm going to talk about a couple of operatic projects that I'm either involved in or that I've been a part of. And one is a really exciting project that just got announced recently. It's called Indians on Vacation. And this was announced by Against the Grain Theatre and Edmonton Opera, who are co-commissioners and co-producers in this project. And if the title of the opera Indians on Vacation sounds familiar, it's because it's actually based on a novel by Thomas King. Thomas King, great Indigenous humorist, novelist, thinker, writer. I mean, he's probably most known for The Inconvenient Indian, which he wrote in, I think, 2012. And the thing I love about Thomas King's texts is how he is able to tell often really heart-wrenching, deep, emotionally connected stories, but he's able to do it with always holding humor at the fore. And so I've really been a huge fan of his writing and just the natural humor that he brings to his work. And in particular, this story, which really just made me so excited and why I wanted to see if I could develop into an opera. And the story itself is this. We have a middle-aged couple. Their names are Mimi and Bird, Indigenous couple. And from the beginning to the end of the novel, they are on vacation in Prague, so in the Czech Republic. And I think just to pause there for a second, if we think about operas, rarely do you have, let's even say, a middle-aged couple as the primary characters of an opera. So it's very, very rare to have anybody that is older, I'm approaching middle age, in these central roles, right? Youth is often held up as the kind of the key standard. So I think that's a unique piece. The second thing is it's super rare to have a middle-aged Indigenous couple in opera. Like that just, I don't know of that happening. And then I think the third thing, which is also really interesting to me, is that they're doing a very, like, I guess you could call it a middle-class activity. They're on vacation in Prague, right? So it's an unexpected environment for these two really fascinating people to be on. And really the whole novel and of course the opera is spent with them reflecting on what does it mean? What does our life mean at this point? Like, who even are we? And, as I think about my own family, my own children, you move through parenting to a certain point that you say, like, who are we as a couple, right? Like what becomes of us when they move out of the house, when the kids move out of the house. And of course, Thomas King in the novel does this with incredible humor. Bird is a bit of a curmudgeon. Mimi is this eternal optimist. She wants to see all the sights. He's got, a sore back and a sore leg and doesn't necessarily want to go out and tour Prague. And he also has with him a number of demons. And these demons are essentially like the voices in his head, not necessarily real voices, but rather, the voice of always he's catastrophizing. He's thinking of the worst possible outcome, or he's panicking about something, or he's depressed about something. So all of those demons get named. And in fact, in the opera, they'll be played by 5 different characters who will kind of always be lurking around the stage and there to sort of shoot out an idea once in a while as they continue on their Prague vacation. So this is, I think, for me, an example of really recentering a narrative that is never in an operatic space. But also, the other funny thing is, if you just look at opera in general, very rarely do humorous operas get written contemporarily. So like there are humorous or funny operas from the historic canon, but rarely do you see them being written as new works. So that was also a fun piece to be able to play with a unique story and being able to tell it in a funny way. And the cool thing with this project is the people involved in making the project happen. Two of the characters are going to be played by Marion Newman, an incredible mezzo-soprano, and Grant Youngblood, who is Lumbee from the United States. And they have been just incredible Indigenous creative, really brilliant singers, bringing all that they have to bear on this piece and making something really unique from it. So I think that the bodies that we have on stage, the type of story that we're telling is really unique for opera. And I think this is kind of like one way into an anti-colonial practice, is really sort of rethinking what we tell. There's another piece that I'm excited about all the projects that I work on, but one that actually has a bit of a connection to the Banff Centre, which is an opera, and it's based on another novel, this time by the writer Cherie Dimaline. And Cherie Dimaline is well known for her writing. She, in particular, is known for her novel The Marrow Thieves, which did really well. And she's written adult novels and a whole bunch of novels coming out this year. In fact, she's got a new novel, Venko, that's coming out, I think, in the next couple of days. And the cool thing about Cherie is that she is a cousin of mine through marriage. We're related to one another, and she is from the Georgian Bay Métis Community. In fact, she lives in my hometown. What's really neat is that Cherie has made a career of telling stories that are many times very local. And in this one novel that is going to be the basis for an upcoming opera, Empire of Wild, it's very much set in our home community. And it is an epic story, fully worthy of a large operatic stage, that tells of this incredible woman named Joan. And Joan is trying to essentially rescue her husband from the grips of this figure, this kind of malevolent figure, but also a very particular figure to the Métis community called the rougarou. And the rougarou is like a form of loup-garou, if you know French, or like a kind of werewolf, you could say, like a Wendigo kind of character, but someone specific to this our Métis community. And so what I love about the story is that it has this incredible grand scale to it. And it is a kind of mythologizing of our own community and our own community stories. It's building and adding to the fabric of the stories that we tell with contemporary voices and contemporary writers who are doing great things like Cherie. And so this project had a little bit of a birth at the Banff Centre. A couple of years ago, as Janine was mentioning, the Banff Centre commissioned an aria from this. And this is an aria where Joan is in a moment of really like self-doubt and isn't sure what the next step is going to be. And she looks to the world around her, the natural world around her, and makes the decision that she's going to step forward and go and take the step to find her husband, Victor. We're going to listen to this probably in its entirety. It's about 5 or 6 minutes, and then we'll come back and talk a little bit more. Thank you. So again, another little excerpt from this opera, and what I think what is really beautiful and what you would see in a fully staged version of this is she's looking to the night to find courage, if you will, to be able to take the next step on this journey to finding and getting her husband back from the grips of this malevolent creature. But at one point, she takes off a cloak and she's wearing this beautiful red gown that has this very detailed Métis beadwork on it. And she says to to the knight, but also to sort of her husband, this is your road. I am your road. This is your map. I am your map. that in some way it's her body, it's her being that becomes the guiding post for the return of her husband. And I think it will be a glorious moment to see on stage as that whole orchestra culminates. Yeah, so this is Empire of Wild, and more information on that will be announced soon about when you can see more of that work. But that was a lot of fun to get to do with the Banff Centre, and this past summer we had a small orchestra, and Brittany, a fantastic singer, sang that for us. Another side of things that I wanted to take a little bit of time to talk about in terms of anti-colonial practice and work within the opera sphere. And again, I mentioned how difficult it is to turn the boat, especially with larger organizations. One organization in Canada that is doing a very, very interesting project that I've been able to be a part of is Calgary Opera. And Calgary Opera has, the last couple of years, been developing an opera called Namoyut, or All Our Relations, or We Are All One, is the title of the piece. And this is really the brainchild of someone I mentioned already, which is Marion Newman. And Marion was approached by the opera company under its director and was told, we'd like you to make something, and you can have complete kind of freedom around how you make that thing and what you make. And here's some money to go and do some workshops and to figure out what that is. And she took that, and instead of saying, you know, let's kind of go the traditional route of we'll get a composer and we'll get a librettist, she's like, let's blow it up and do more. I mean, she's from the West Coast, and so they have the longhouse tradition, but let's do what might feel more like sort of like a ceremonial, community-based group project of building an opera. This is, again, there's no real precedence in opera for this kind of opera making, where you have multiple people writing the music, where you have multiple people writing the text, where you have performers who are in the room commenting on what the story is and developing it in real time together. And so she basically pulled together several of her friends and colleagues, myself included, and this birthed a project that is in development over the next several years, called Namoyut. And this was a really important step for myself and for many of us to answering the question, is it possible with a larger arts organization to have a more indigenized way of making a practice that looks different than the way it's typically made in these big institutional spaces? The answer that we found from that exploration, and we're continuing to develop, is yes, it is possible. Some of the learnings that have come from this in terms of the development of the piece, having multiple voices commenting on what a story is, can be really fruitful. It's amazing the kind of ideas that can be generated from the people in the room. And when I say people in the room, if somebody walks into the room, let's say to empty a garbage can, they're part of the circle. So they are invited to comment on what's going on. There's no, person who has the final say, major authority. It's again, as we've been describing it, it's a turning of the sort of triangular structure of leadership and of decision making on its side and kind of expanding it out to make a circle. One of the cool things about that process, when we are gathered together, and usually we're together for a couple of weeks of making, we start our days with a circle. We sit in circle and we check in. And this process is usually led by Yvette Nolan, who's working on the project as a librettist, one of the librettists on the project. And she guides us through a time of really starting the day well and starting it in a good way. And it's amazing. If you were to look at this process, if you were kind of working from a more usual Western way of running a company, you would probably think that this is a very, very wasteful use of an hour of a 6-hour day. Because 1 hour, 1/6 of the day, is going to people sitting and talking, not about the work at all. And what we found is that this hour or 45 minutes of talking and sort of starting the day in a good way, in a relational way that's based on a series of values that we've predetermined together as a group, leads to some of the most exciting and fruitful music making, art making in the next 5 hours of the day, because really the work is starting in that first hour, and you're able to sort of process where you are and sometimes leave some of those things that you bring into the room in a way like to the side, so that you can do the work, or to bring in those things into the day, into the work that you make. And this has yielded really beautiful work, a beautiful story that is continuing to evolve and develop, some lovely music that will include captured sounds of the world, of the natural world, mixed with orchestral sounds and orchestral sort of traditional operatic music, and bringing all of those things, including an element of improvisation into the work. And I think we're gonna end with a piece that is unique and that is based on a different and really anti-colonial way of making art. So that's Namoyut, and an important and exciting project that is happening in Canadian opera. There's another piece that I want to talk a little bit about, and that has been very important to me in my career, and I was brought into in a way that felt a little bit strange, but has become really quite important to me as the years have gone by since. And this is based on the project is Louis Riel. For the Métis folks in the room, of course, Louis Riel is the, I guess sometimes called the father of Manitoba, the leader of the Métis people, led some resistances in the late 19th century. And there's an opera, believe it or not, made about this figure. The opera comes from 1967. And it was composed by Harry Summers, a Canadian composer, and the text is by Mavor Moore, a Canadian librettist. And they built this opera at a time, I mean, this was the 100th anniversary of Canada as a nation. And so they were given this huge commission to write a major, new, important Canadian opera. And they were given the choice of subject matter, and they chose quite an unlikely figure for a celebration of the centennial of a nation, partly because Louis Riel was hanged for treason in 1885. So an unlikely subject less than 100 years later, and especially with views on Riel, which can be all over the place depending on who you talk to. And so they wrote this opera. The problem, or some of the challenges that come from that opera, is that some of the choices that were made in how they told that story haven't aged well, and probably weren't even good back in the day. And I'll outline a couple of them. There are some sort of like stereotypical scenes of Indigenous people. There is also some appropriated music in the piece, which is sort of where I come into the story. And all of these things really were known about the opera, but it was remounted by a couple of companies in Canada in 2017 to celebrate the sesquicentennial, so the 150th anniversary of Canada. They thought, let's remount this major Canadian opera, and that was what happened. And at the time, there was now new consultation. We're past the 2015 TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's findings. And so it was very clear that a new approach had to be taken to the work, specifically also because there was no Indigenous creator in the original work. There were two non-Indigenous people writing the music and the text for the story, and really shaping how the story was told of an important Indigenous historic figure. And so a whole bunch of things were brought in to make these productions, the productions that happened in 2017, make more sense. And many of those, I think, were successful. Some of them also just showed more, I think, the problems that are inherent in that work. And one of the most problematic pieces was a little bit of music that happens at the top of the third act. So just to set the scene, at the beginning of the third act, so much has happened, right? And Riel has fled Canada, and he's in Montana with his wife and their little baby. And as his wife, he's reading some letters at a table, and his wife is rocking the baby. She sings a lullaby to the baby. Well, Harry Summers wrote this lullaby based on a Cree text, a Cree grammar book text. So it's kind of a nonsensical text. It's like, the sun is rising, there is the dog, just Cree sounding words. I mean, they're Cree. And music that had been collected by an ethnographer, Marius Barbeau, in, I think, the 1930s, from the Nisga'a people. In particular, there's a Limoy, a song of mourning, that he heard and wrote down. And this was put into like a text, like a book, where this music of Indigenous peoples was available for for composers to look at. And Harry Summers thought, well, what better way of making a Canadian impact on music than bringing in music of the First Peoples. So I do believe that intentions of Summers and Mavor Moore were good in trying to do this. Unfortunately, there was a misunderstanding of protocol around this music. It was ceremonial music. It was music that was not to be performed in any kind of performance. It was songs of mourning, a song of mourning, and also required particular hereditary permission to even sing. And so without knowing any of that context, or even having any of that context, it was put into this opera and kind of made into this lullaby. Again, a song of mourning made into a lullaby. And so this was brought to the attention of the companies producing the opera by Dylan Robinson and others. Dylan Robinson is a researcher, an Indigenous researcher, and has looked into a lot of operas and other historic and cultural works that are held in places like Canadian Music Centre, et cetera, and conversations with the Nisga'a people about what was to be done. And a decision was made that they were going to commission new music to be written for that part of the opera that would replace the lullaby that had appropriated music. And I was invited to come in and write that music. And so what emerged from this is a new piece called Dodo mon tout petit, or Sleep My Little One. And interestingly enough, the text for the piece that I set actually was written by Mavor Moore, the original librettist, but it was unused in the first production. Again, Harry Summers used the Cree grammar text. And so I was able to go back to at least one of the creators' original ideas, and set a text that is quite beautiful. And so what has emerged from this is forever, this opera will be performed with this new aria in place of the appropriated one. And work is actually going on right now, even to this day. I mean, it's been several years of consultations, of conversations, commissioning the music, et cetera. But we're talking about appropriate steps to continue the act of redressing this appropriated music. That includes things like in any published score that is held in any library in Canada, an explanatory note either has to be included, or the score becomes replaced with the new score. There's a whole set of conversations that are happening as to how to kind of tackle an immense problem. I mean, we have similar conversations, I think, in artworks that have been taken and that are in museum holdings of Indigenous peoples. And this is kind of the musical version of returning a work that was taken without consent to a people, and based on their terms of how they want that managed and dealt with. So very, very complicated, very exciting project to be a part of. Just as a composer, I felt like a lot of pressure in doing this work, but I also felt a lot of like, I was never going to please anybody, rewriting a composer's music immediately raised alarms of censorship to people. So I heard that a lot from folks. coming into a work where there's a particular style, this very brutalist 1960s music style, my language is not the same, was going to, bring up questions of comparison and, did I make the right decisions musically? And I kind of just took all of that on and just said, you know what, I'm just going to write the best piece of music I can write, and hopefully some people will appreciate it. We only have a couple of minutes left, but I thought maybe we could just play the opening little bit of this piece, the first 2 minutes of, and then we'll come back and wrap up. Great. Just one really quick word about those opening motifs. You heard this both in the harp and in the flute, and I imagine them in this cold kind of home that's drafty, like a log cabin, and there's cracks in the walls, so there's wind coming through, and something of that was the winter wind. And then you heard the strings play, and I just envisioned a cradle rocking back and forth. And so that's something that I like to play with, imitating the sounds of the worldscape that we're in the sounds of the music. Thank you so much for listening.
Wow, thank you for that sharing, Ian. It's so nice to see. I was there in the second video when you presented the aria with my sons, Delari and Corwin. And I think you inspired Corwin to consider that path, because I asked him, I said, well, what did you think of it? He's like, there's costumes, there's dance, there's a stage, there's design, there's singing. He's like, what's not to like? And so that whole time I could see him reading subtitles, looking down, like he was so busy. So yeah, I thought I'd share that. Plus I got to meet you in person that day. So extra bonus there.
Oh my gosh, thank you for sharing that. That makes my heart happy. Like, that's what it's about, right? I hope he'll take up the mantle.
Yes, well, definitely. I know you inspired my other one. He appreciated it, but I can tell Corwin really took it in. So you'll have someone in the crowd and hopefully someone on stage there with you doing some of the work. And so, yeah, we actually will be continuing this conversation tomorrow. It's a good thing this is in 2 parts. So everybody here, please join us at the same time, wherever you're joining from. And yeah, we'd just like to thank the RBC for funding this program today. And big thank you to everyone there, Miigwech Tinigi, and we'll see you all tomorrow. And thanks, Ian. This was a really wonderful session. Oh, Tanse Tawau, everyone. Welcome back. Ian, so great to hear your talk yesterday and to have this time and next hour to spend together.
Thanks so much for having me again, and I look forward to tonight's chat.
Oh, for sure. So I'm still joining from Sacred Buffalo Guardian Mountain here on the slope of, well, known as Tunnel Mountain, but we go by the other reference, but on Banff Centre grounds. And so, yeah, definitely we met a few years ago, but we met online, and then I was able to catch you in person here on campus. So it's been a couple years now since we've known each other.
It has been, yeah. And we spent quite a bit of time together that first year during the opera program. It was something like maybe 12 or 14 weeks, something like that.
Yeah, I think it was 3 iterations of 3 weeks or so. But I remember the
Yeah.
first time I didn't actually know what I got myself into. Sometimes I say yes because it sounds awesome. And so going into that space, I actually really learned a lot and didn't even know that there was Indigenous artists and composers in the opera discipline.
Yeah.
And so I actually wanted to start there in terms of you being your journey into opera and how you found yourself in that medium.
Yeah. I think, and I think by extension, even to what you just said, like there aren't a lot of Indigenous composers in like classical music at all, which is, but there is a growing group of us, and we're starting to make more intentional connections. In fact, actually, several of those have happened at the Banff Centre, where we've gotten together to share. I mean, we come from all different communities, all different kinds of backgrounds, all different kinds of classical music styles, even, and that's been really, really important. And we can for sure talk about that and the good work that's happening right across the land. Yeah, I came to opera. I think I came to opera at a very young age, and there was something about it that really just impressed me and moved me. And it's funny, like any work of art, any piece, even a pop song or something on the top 40 or a movie, anything that really just captures or grabs my emotions are works that I love, or styles of work that I love and I'm drawn to. And for me, it was like that right from the beginning with opera. And I think just because it's so of a huge epic scale, and it's so big, it's so in your face that it's like it takes like the regular human experience emotions, and it jacks it up to the highest level, where the most intense kind of interactions and conflicts can happen. But it really allows the viewer, the listener, the audience to feel on a really deep level. So that's what brought me there as a young person, and that's actually what keeps me here to this day.
Well, it's a very exciting medium. Like as I was saying, when Corwin, I took Corwin, he's 16 now, and Delari's 18. And so when we did have the opportunity to see your piece in person, which you had presented a small component of your upcoming opera that was being workshopped here, what I really took from what Corwin was saying was how it really intersects so many different components. So from the
Yeah.
costumes, the lighting, the stage, even to language, because there was different pieces there. And, we were reading up there, but there was something that you didn't even need to know the
Yeah.
English. You could feel the music and the emotion. And so there's a ton of layers in that medium.
Oh, for sure. And you know what? I think that actually is exactly right. Like if you're watching on stage or even just listening to the music, even if you don't understand the language, let's say it's in Italian or German or another language, or even English, but it's hard to sometimes hear exactly what the words are, you should be able to tell from everything that's being kind of thrown at you. It's the whole package, like you said, of artistic disciplines coming together to create an experience that is understandable, even if the words maybe aren't the language we particularly speak. And I think what's really cool is the potential for Indigenous languages to be represented in opera, just because it's a form that is so used to having languages that are foreign to somebody, right? So like German opera, if let's say I'm an Italian speaker, well, it's going to be foreign to me. So that's a kind of that's an accepted quantity in opera. So I feel like there is a lot of space for languages that haven't lived on our stages. to be represented. And there is some opera. There was actually a Sami opera that was shown in Toronto, Galabartnet, a couple of years ago, and by a Sami librettist, and beautiful piece and in the Sami language. So it was very, very cool.
Yeah, I think that's what I really loved and appreciated about the time we spent in opera was how much learning in terms of even how much European cultures influenced it over the years and then being folded into our climate. And with your participation, I really learned a lot about how it isn't just what I thought it was. I think even myself as an Indigenous woman sometimes can stereotype some of these disciplines and how much I
Sure.
actually learned through the conversations that we had. And
Yeah,
so,
and it was cool that the program brought together, I don't know, about 20 participants, I believe, and faculty as well. And it became a place to hear of people from completely different experiences and backgrounds as well. So that, like you said, it added a whole other layer and dimension. There were folks who come from various gender expressions, and they were able to talk about what their experience is like when they're asked to play a certain type of role, or and I guess and there were so many backgrounds and experiences there that really shed different perspective, even for me, on what opera is and what it means to be a performer or an artist in opera.
yeah, I definitely got a lot of respect for all the participants and the faculty, some of them that I still have stayed in connection with since we first connected. And so definitely I'm continuously learning more and more. But what I wanted to kind of unpack, because you talked a little bit about processes and the importance of those check-ins. Like for me, I felt like I was very much there listening and contributing in whatever story I can offer that made sense. But I really felt that you guys built almost like a family over those weeks. Like there was such kinship by the end of that program that, that's what I really took away from our time together.
Yeah. I think that process, I mean, it probably is similar. I wonder for you, even like with your film background, I'm sure being on a set and being in that kind of close knit creative relationship with a group of people for a period of time, it builds these networks of connection and kinship, like you said. But for sure, I think that happens a lot in opera programs and in the presenting of operas. Actually, I'd say probably one of the hardest things, and unless you've done performing arts of some kind, you may not exactly have the experience. But people are brought together for, let's say, 5 weeks, or maybe it's a couple of months, to work on an opera. They're very, very intensely working together. They're getting to going through a whole range of emotional experiences, like nervousness, maybe fatigue, maybe whatever it might be, and just artistic, pumping of artistic energy into a work, and often living very close to this same group of people that they're working with. And then you have closing night, and the show closes, and it can feel very, very, very isolating or disconnecting after that process, because you've had such a close journey with people. And then you might be going back to your home or off to another city to sort of begin that process again, and then have that disconnection at the end. It's not spoken about a lot, but I think it is a really can be a very trying experience for performing arts folks.
Yeah, I would understand that. I think that's the one thing in my discipline as being a filmmaker outside of my role at the Banff Centre is you bring people together, you have this very intimate experience, you're eating at craft services,
Yeah.
you're building trust, you really have to respect the people you bring in. And then you end up carrying this legacy and that responsibility to continue to honor the people who you folded in, your storytellers, your camera person. And so, yeah, I can definitely see how that relationship is important. And as part of my practice, I've always tried to, well, there's different words, but we were talking a little bit in our pre-chat, decolonize the process, indigenize the process. But
Yeah.
you mentioned anti-colonial practices, and I wanted to spend some time unpacking that a bit in terms of how that fits into your medium and your approach to your work.
Yeah. I think all of those words, like we also brought up the word reconciliation, which gets bandied about a lot, and has come to almost like lose its meaning, I think, especially post 2015 Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and that word has changed a lot in our communities. But I think it's interesting to think of the words like decolonial practice. I have friends who are scholars, and they say that's very much work that's tied to land return, and often they'll use words like anti-colonial work. And it's interesting because both words, decolonial, anti-colonial work, is sort of like a pushing back against a tradition, pushing back against a system that is sometimes, I mentioned this last night, sometimes completely unaware of itself. Like folks that say work in an orchestral environment are so acclimatized to how it all works that they don't even think that there could be another way of it working, because they're just in it completely. And that makes sense, because we can get really into something. So anti-colonial, decolonial, like a pushing against a system. Whereas, like you said, indigenizing is bringing a series of values to bear on a space, on a process, on a group of people. And I think both of those terms are valuable because it helps us to look at the same kind of work from a different angle and a different lens. For example, you just said something that really struck me, and I want to think more about this in my own practices. You build a relationship in the work you do in film with a group of people. There's a lot of trust that's built. And in some ways, you've made an indelible mark on their life, and they have made an indelible mark on your life. And the relationship, just because the work is done, if, let's say, producing a film and putting it together, it does not mean that relationship ends. And you have now a tie and maybe in some ways you could use the word like responsibility in that person's life that has been opened up by that work that's happened on a deep level. And I'd like to think about that with opera work. What does it mean when a project comes to an end, and what are my responsibilities to the people I worked with? What are their responsibilities to me? And how does that relate to the work we made? Like, so maybe we made an opera together, our stewardship of that art piece, that work. And then what are our relationships or our responsibilities to one another outside of the artwork, outside of the opera that we made or that we worked on together? I think that's really beautiful, and it's so much more human, right, way of working.
Yeah, definitely, because I feel like, when you revisit and you reconnect with someone, often you don't know the impact you have until you reconnect again. And sometimes, you realize it's been a journey for them, either if they've been, especially like with some of my actors who were non-actors going into one of my feature films. And then I've revisited with one of them not too long ago, and was letting me know how they felt that they were, one, recognized, and how they kind of re-looked at their participation in the film, and then just how they grew, and then how that film became part of their world, even though they weren't watching it every day.
Right.
But as it got shared out, they ended up being recognized for it. So they never seen themselves as, oh, I'm not an actress. She actually worked at Robertson's Trading Post.
Oh, wow.
So she's like, it sometimes would throw her off a bit, but became an important story bundle for her, from what I understand, because then she started to feel like she was carrying that legacy with her. And so that really hit me when we were talking more about it.
That's actually really beautiful. And I think there's something in that too about like not seeing yourself in that space. Maybe this actor didn't see themselves as, I'm not an actress, so I couldn't do that. And then to see yourself in that space. But what that also means for those that are not standing by, but that are watching, that maybe are the next generation, the younger folk that go, oh, like there is a space for me there. And I know that is very true, or at least is very close to my heart and close to the hearts of a lot of the Indigenous people that are working in classical music, including opera and orchestral music and all kinds of stuff. We talk a lot about the next generation and how is it that the young person that is maybe doesn't have connection to the classical music world, wouldn't even know how to enter into that space. How can we be opening doors for them? How can we be providing maybe training for them, like coachings or whatever it might be, and also just be providing the example to say, like, you could do this too. In fact, this is completely available to you, and let us help you along that journey. I think that's really, really important in this work, especially where representation is super low for Indigenous folks and other marginalized folks and in these spaces.
Yeah, no, definitely. Because I mean, it takes a long time to have the confidence to embody these labels, titles, roles as we're moving forward. And it's even like, when are you emerging to when are you intermediate to when are you advanced? Like, I feel like I always say, well, because I'm learning all the time. Oh, I'm emerging. And I was told, stop saying that. You've been doing this for 10 years. Okay, I'm intermediate then.
You've emerged.
Okay, I'll stop saying emerging, but I always feel like I'm still learning.
100%. Okay, I think that is, it's so good that you say that, because I think for folks like that aren't necessarily on that journey, you're like, oh, it's obvious once you've emerged. Well, to you or to me, it feels like I'm the same person. I'm kind of doing the same thing. I've just been doing it for a bit of time, and I guess my label's changed, right? I was thinking, like, maybe it's when you get the big, like, Order of Canada award that you're in your advanced stage, or maybe that means your career's done. I don't know, but it's funny too, like, maybe attached to that is, and it's something that I'll share from my own experience, is this imposter syndrome feeling that I think is really common and not necessarily talked about a lot by a lot of people, because, you know, social media or whatever it is, you project a vision or a picture of yourself as, oh, I'm so confident and I can do all these things. And I think people don't necessarily realize how scary putting yourself out there artistically can be. Like in my case, making, I hate the word product because it's not really a product, but a piece of music, an art piece that you then put in front of an audience, you put in front of critics. Some people don't love it, some people hate it, some people think it's the best thing, right? And how vulnerable that feeling can be, and how often, even if you do get to the emerging or past the emerging part of your career, and I know we're the same age and probably about the same part in our career too, you're at the intermediate phase. It's like, you're like, do I deserve this, or am I really that, or are they really just going to see that I don't know what I'm doing, you know? And I think that feeling stays with us for a long time, maybe to the end, maybe to the very end, when we get our Orders of Canada or whatever that symbol is that we've made it to the top. I don't know.
Yeah, I think part of that is, you know, different Indigenous groups have different values, but often we hear about practicing humility, not having too much pride. And then so growing up, you go into a medium where you're encouraged to put yourself out to the world, and you're encouraged to be more confident sometimes than you feel. And so then how that negotiation of values, because we all want to be successful on our journey. But, you know, you said the word vulnerable, you know, that definitely, when you put it out, it takes a life of its own. And then, you know, that's where I always feel the most vulnerable.
Yeah.
And then how that actually on a day-to-day, you know, impacted my mental health, even just like that self-care and, you know, making sure I'm not taking things personally, that it's about my art. It's not about Janine.
Yeah.
And so, you know, those components I find play a big part on that journey.
Oh yeah, and I think one of the best things to have to help counter that is are people around you that you love and that you trust. I mean, a great version of this is children, because they kind of remind you of who you are, and they remind you of where you come from. And you know, my wife laughs about this, but she's the kind of person who I'm like, hey, guess what? I'm doing this thing, or I just wrote this thing. And she's like, that's great. Can you take out the garbage, please? And I joke about that, and she's like, oh, I sound awful when I say that, but I'm like, no, it's perfect, and don't ever change it, because that's exactly what what is the counterbalance to it? I mean, of course, I want my family to be excited about something that's happening, and they are for sure. But they're also like, this is this is real life as well. And you go, oh, okay, I think maybe it helps us make better art, right? Maybe it helps that humility and those values that we can bring to the practice is what keeps us actually more an enjoyable person to work with, hopefully making more enjoyable artistic experiences for our collaborators and our audiences, and keeps our head on our shoulders, and it doesn't ever let us kind of think that we've kind of become superhuman, because that never happened. That doesn't happen, and that isn't a real thing.
That's
Although
true.
some believe it is.
Well, even when people meet my kids for the first time, because they're part of my practice, they're, with consent now, they're on my social media.
Yeah.
And so, people feel like they know them, but then they will also talk to them and say, you know how amazing your mom is? You know how she does all this stuff? And they're like, yeah, and she's my mom.
She's my mom.
And I'm like, yeah, at the end of the day, the other part of me, my work life, my career life, but being able to just be mom at the end of the day, I think for me is why we do the work, even if we're attaining to this next level of our career.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, I think the greatest reminder is like, changing a diaper and being like, oh, wow, okay. Or I was going to share why it's the dinner hour here in Toronto, so I won't share the gruesome details of that we all know, right?
Oh, yeah. Many of us. Part of the journey. Good stories. I'm going to go to, we have a question in the chat from Francis Allman. So thank you both again for sharing your time with us. I'm wondering about the use of the word anti-colonial. I'm using words such as decolonize and indigenize and also post-colonial. This is the first I've heard of the word anti-colonial, and I hear you using it mindfully. I'm living in the, and if I'm incorrect in the pronunciation, please forgive me, is Sapmi? Although I am not Sapmi, or is that Sami? Do you know? Perhaps it is a word used more on your lands. I'd love to hear your thoughts about why you use the word anti-colonial. And I apologize if I mispronounced the word there.
I think this is a great question, and I want to say for sure. Oh yeah, Sami. Yeah, Sami. Right. Cool. And I want to say, for example, I'm for sure not an expert in this. I do have a good friend, as I mentioned, who is an Indigenous researcher at the University of Toronto, and has really helped me think through some of these terms, and they do it far more thoughtfully than I do, and also would be able to give us a great explanation why. But their thinking, as shared with me, and hopefully I represent it well, is decolonial work is and needs to be tied to the return of lands that have been taken, the return of lands that have been occupied, and that a lot of the practice work that we do in the artistic sphere can't be a part of that. That has to happen at government levels and at levels beyond what our art can touch in a direct way, although our art could comment upon it, could move people to want to consider some things like that, but it can't actually affect a change directly. And that was their sort of differentiation between the two, if I've captured it properly. But I think, just at least from my experience, and I'd love to hear too what how you see the terms, Janine, but I probably use them fairly interchangeably. One word that a lot of, I'll just throw this out here for your thoughts, because I want to hear your thoughts on this too, is the word reconciliation. Again, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was published in 2015, which had a very, very in-depth, lots of interviews that had happened, but about a whole range of things, and particular people groups in Canada. And after that, there became a lot of conversation of, we want to do reconciliation work. And I found, and what other colleagues of mine found, was that organizations, big orchestras, big, companies were like, let's get to reconciliation. And what the pushback was is like, well, we need to spend more time in the truth part, like the actually sitting in what has happened and what has gone on in a government sanctioned way on these lands for like hundreds of years, even before we were a nation. And so, but then the word got bandied about a lot, like, oh, we're putting on this concert, therefore we're doing reconciliation, we're good. And it became a kind of cheapened term. At least that's the experience that I saw, and that I saw a lot of people kind of going like, I checked the box, I've done reconciliation, let's move on, we can continue. And it's like, oh, this is like this is generations of work that needs to be done. This is like at every structure of every organization kind of work. It's not just a ticked box. And so that word doesn't get used as much in Canada, I find, in 2023. When it does, people usually wince at it a little bit more. So even in 8 years, there's been a real shift of like reconciliation. Some people say reconciliation feels dead, feels like we're a long ways away from that. But Janine, what are your thoughts on these terms and also on reconciliation? I'm very curious.
Well, definitely, I was a statement gatherer for the TRC for many years. And so for part of my role in terms of that movement was I was taking statements from the elders, the intergenerational survivors, and people who ran the schools. And so for that, my big part was listening and capturing. And so in that process, we did take care in terms of like post care, do they need cultural support, and then making sure that they're comfortable with how their statements are used. So they were able to do it anonymous, they were able to pull it if they didn't feel comfortable, or they were able to put restrictions on how it's shared. So, the idea was like, how through this information can we see the impact through story? So when the TRC calls to action came out and I was reading what kind of felt like bylaws, like more legal jargon, I was able to unpack that through, oh, okay, this reminds me of one of the statements that I heard and how it came from someone's story. And so
Right.
as I started moving through it, I realized when I read them all, I was like, this is something that I don't think Janine can do in my lifetime.
Hmm.
And so I did go back to the committee because I eventually ended up doing a lot of work with the Regina Indian Industrial School. There was 36 graves that were identified. And in 2015, we got the city of Regina to accept the calls to action. And then from that, we advocated and got municipal and provincial protection. And so
Wow.
based on those stories, at that point, I was telling people there's going to be at least 250,000 graves that are going to be found based on the estimates and what I was collecting. But at the time, we hadn't had, other than those 36,
Right.
much evidence, conversation, or people looking into that just yet. And so I felt like while I was doing reconciliation work, I was doing a lot of education.
Yeah.
And I feel like, there's accepting the truth, but there's a lot of people who really just didn't know or couldn't accept because it was really big things that I was throwing out there. So
Yeah.
I realized the best way was for me to do things slowly, not because sometimes when you put people in shock, they just default.
For sure.
It's like the frog will want to leave the hot water type of thing. So,
Yep.
for me, I felt like it was ongoing in terms of like continuing to build it out. And I found art. So through film, I created a film about it and used that to have people talk about the issue
Wow.
rather than having it being opinions back and forth. It was like,
Yeah.
let's talk about what's happening here. And then all of a sudden later on, when Kamloops came out and then Cowazis, and then it continued going, there was people who came back and they said, I should have been listening back then, but I hear
Wow.
what you're saying now because I can see it. And so those numbers are just starting to get out there. But
Yeah.
based on a lot of the work, we still got a long way to go. And also knowing we might never get the full scope of the truth because
Yeah.
some of that is now taken to the grave, so to speak. And then also, one of the sad realities is that a lot of family lines are now no longer existing. So there's just family groups, and why that's so important in terms of decolonization, indigenization, all those words. But a lot of our teachings were tied within a family and were handed down intergenerationally. So when you lose a whole family, you lose a whole string of teachings that were often from a very young age given and foundational. And so when I was growing up, my mom, I never actually liked the word, she's an activist, only because my mom said it was my responsibility. So I seen that I should be doing this every day in small ways, big ways, as an individual within my family. And so I just continued doing the work. And so when I did my master's, we were at the point of unpacking, it was decolonizing oral history and documentary. So I was trying to find a space for how we can deconstruct how documentaries are done and build relationships. But it was taking a look at how we look at the 3-act structure as like there's some ending. So what I did was I did 10 short videos and made them each into story bundles. So I started taking what I was learning growing up and what I was hearing from community and then applying them to the practice. So that was my first real hands-on experience.
Wow.
And then I started looking at, okay, well, what about the crew that I'm building? So then, to me, I also really want someone who's exceptional in their field, regardless of their background. So as much as I was attaining to a more Indigenous crew, the reality was we can still learn from each other. So then I said, okay, maybe I want my leads to be Indigenous. So definitely that, people doing the creative agency. But how can we build mentorship with people who are exceptional, who also respect the values of what you're putting together? So I kind of moved into more indigenizing the process.
Amazing.
And so I didn't think about the terms though. They were being applied to me. And so with the cemetery, people were saying, okay, now she's doing reconciliation work. So I found I was just doing my responsibility as an Indigenous mother, and whatever things that were happening, I was folding them into there. But I really felt like our processes and knowledge grows as we grow. So it's hard to fit ourselves in one box, I guess, so to speak. It's how do we mindfully use the language where it's appropriate, but making sure it's meaningful, intentional, and there's a legacy. Because you're right, we don't want to just check a box. We want to know that we created impact that our kids are going to benefit from, because that's the real mission right there. So I don't know if I answered it, but
no,
there you
you
go.
Totally did. But I feel I love this because it's like you were just doing the work, and then it's like, oh, you're doing X work or this work, whatever the title is, but you're doing the work. And I think something you said that makes me think about something I'm really excited to do in the opera world is again when I have agency over a piece. And it's interesting what agency looks like, right? And probably what the word is really is power in an organization. If I'm commissioned to write an opera, I don't have a lot of power over it, although I can technically write whatever music I would want. But in the structure of how it all comes together, I don't have a lot of say. And I've been trying to argue for more say so that I can have a space, like a door open to bringing some of these values into the practice. So in terms of like say on who is cast, say on who is put into the main artistic or like lead roles, like you were saying, and then to talk about how the process of making an opera can have a level of mentorship in it as well, so that the young aspiring stage manager person or like lighting person or sound designer or whatever can have a shadowing opportunity where they get real hands-on training from these exceptional people who are doing the work. and so that it becomes like a legacy project. So not only are we making this one opera or this one film, I guess in your case, but we're also building up the next generation of filmmakers, opera makers, theater makers, whatever their interests might be. I think it's
Yeah.
really, really cool.
You know, one thing I was reflecting on was in the time we spent in the opera program, you know, it became over the weeks, people were seeing the challenge in terms of how they were on their journey. But because we were so busy sharing our success in projects and how we achieved stuff, there was almost this idea that we had to revisit that our journeys were actually pretty difficult to get to where we were. And so, you know, I think because we are trying to shine light and mentor, I remember we met once and we said, okay, let's talk about what it actually took to get us to where we were and some of the challenges we went through. And for me, that was important too. Just it gave me a chance to reflect, but it also gave me that understanding of your journey and the journey of the other faculty that we had in that program.
It was such an incredible time of sharing. Like I think we had about an hour for each of us, of the kind of key faculty sharing. And not only did my respect for each of those people skyrocket after that, and it was already high to begin with because of all of the superficial things that we see, like, oh, you're a great tenor, you're a great whatever, you're a great filmmaker, oh, I'm already impressed by your CV. But now you've shared the journey to get there, and it's like I have so much more respect for you than I had even before. And part of what was really, really interesting in those conversations was the common thread of it was not an easy road. And I think that, like, I think that again, I go back to social media as an example of like putting up a pretend version of ourselves. It always looks so much easier for the other person, right? Like they just made it. They just were given these gifts, and they just kind of went perfect. But what we learned was that the road was not straight for any of the people doing this really exciting work. And that was the same for all the participants in the program as well. And that was a really humanizing part of that work. And I think that's it, like humanizing, right? Humanizing these artistic spaces, because they're made up of human beings called artists who are human beings who have lives and journeys and families and communities and trials and successes and joys. And if we dehumanize people, then it's easy to either put them on pedestals or put them in the gutter. And neither are the right place for any human to be, where we all need to be standing on the same level ground with all of our valuable things to contribute, which every human brings. And so, yeah, I think that was a really, really important thing. And I love stories of artists' journeys to sort of remind me that, oh, you're a human being like me.
Yeah, and what I really took from that is we really got to understand everyone's values, because I think, you know, as an Indigenous person, we all have different cultural values that we identify, but as artists, we also have our values we're bringing to the table. And so I think that definitely humanized the process.
For
And
sure.
in that, you know, I think that is also another form of how we put that Indigenous connection in there, was
Yeah.
having those conversations and pulling that out. Otherwise, we do leave this image of who we think we should be, just going back to, we got to put ourselves out there. We got to put out
Yeah.
our strengths so people want to promote our work.
Yeah.
But yeah, we forget
Yeah.
about that.
I think so. And I think in the end, we end up discouraging people more than we think. Like if you just show all of your great accolades, then you're just really like, someone else is like, well, that's just not for me because I could never do that. And I think that's not really about building into the art forms. And I think that's another cool thing, is to think about the art forms that we're in, opera making, filmmaking, whatever it might be, as generational as well, right? They're not just, we're in one moment of these art forms, and they're going to transform after our time, just like they've transformed up until now. And we want to be like putting this, helping the seeds in the soil to root and to grow and to flourish and to really take the art forms that we get the, let's say, to be honest, the privilege to be a part of. Like, it's incredible that we get to do the things we get to do, but we want to see these art forms cultivated and grown to tell the next stories of the next generations, right? And so that's the work of being, like you said, being humble and being truthful and human in these spaces. I think it really is setting up that next generation for their place to take in this work.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, some of the trips and things look so glamorous, but when people realize, like, can I swipe this? Am I going to get my card on hold? Am I going to eat
Yeah.
at this airport and just nibble on these snacks I put together?
Oh
Like,
my gosh.
the reality of you're actually like making it by, and then, yeah, you get paid later, but you know, the feast and famine part of the arts.
Oh, Janine. Oh my gosh. I feel like you just like saw into my life of a couple of weeks ago. I was in the Yukon, by the way. I was in the Yukon working on Indians on vacation with like an incredible group of people. And I remember, this is bad that I'm saying this publicly, but I got to the airport and I was like, is my card going to decline when I try to get that $20 salad at the airport? And I'm like, who in the world is selling a $20 salad at the Vancouver airport? But it was that total feeling, right? You know, it's, people don't think it's like that, but it is like that.
Yeah, definitely. Like, even when I was starting, everybody was like, well, this is good exposure for you. And I made the comment, well, I can't feed my kids exposure.
That's right.
And they were like, oh, what the reality was, I'm putting myself out there, but there's a point where I really have to make sure that there's dinner on the table, my bills
Yeah.
are paid, I can swipe. And so, that behind the scenes of actually being an active artist and
Yeah,
investing, but also like that, I guess, juggling that we have to do is a
absolutely.
reality.
Yeah, and I think another reality that I think is important that is starting to get talked about more. I know in music schools, for example, I did a talk at the Glenn Gould School where I went to school in the late '90s, and I was talking with them, and the professor was saying we use the term portfolio artist a lot more now, and I think that word, I don't remember it existing in the late '90s. It probably did, because in the late '90s, and still to this day, there was this real fear of, if I say to someone I'm a singer, but I'm also working at Starbucks, they're going to think I'm not serious enough about my singing career. And this was something that the participants brought up in our opera program a couple of years ago. This fear of, well, I got to pay the bills, so it means that I'm going to have to be bivocational or tri-vocational, having multiple jobs and multiple sources of income. But I think it's hopefully becoming more normalized and more accepted now that that's the reality for everybody, right? Like, it's great to be able to do one thing only, but probably you'll be a better artist if you have a diverse set of income streams that are enriching your experience of life and experience of being human. That'll probably feed your art better, and it'll certainly feed your children's bellies.
Yes. Oh, for sure. And one thing I was thinking, because we both work in very, I guess, Western idea mediums, I often find that people kind of time cast what Indigenous identity is. And so, I often think about what my mom said, because I always talk to my mom. I was dwelling on, that I'm not an Indigenous person, pre-colonial. So what does that mean for me today? And she was like, well, she said, think about it. When they introduced the cast iron pan,
Hmm.
we adapted that into our practice. She said, yeah, it was nice that we can heat up a rock and warm up our soup, but do you know how long that took in a day? And she
Yeah.
said, and so now that we got this cast iron pan, that frees up time for us to do more of our sewing, our quilling, and it
Yeah.
freed up time for family. So she said, we can take tools, but we can also keep putting our values and our teachings and using them. So she said, those people 100 years ago are not the same as the other 100 years ago. She said,
Yeah.
we're active in terms of how our identity is changing.
And I think that is okay, brilliant, because and it's interesting, like when someone has an idea of what indigenous experience is, they're usually trying to find one answer, which is ridiculous, this whole pan-indigenous thing. I mean, it doesn't include considerations of, are you from the north? Are you from a remote community? Are you from the res? Are you from an urban center? What access did you have to opportunities as a kid? Like, there's so many pieces. What has life looked like generationally, right? Like, there's so many pieces that make up our own individual experiences that it's almost as diverse as the number of people that there are, right? Because every experience is kind of unique. And it's interesting when you say that idea of like the idea of the indigenous person or artist. It's like one slice of time, but just like you said, like 100 years ago, they might have had the cast iron pan, but 100 years before that, they may not have. And so any slice of time that you take is going to be a different picture that is captured. And all of them are true. All of them are right, because they're part of living human beings, living peoples that are adapting and that are resilient, that are enfolding new ideas and new cultural practices into their own understanding. But like you said, doing that within a value system, I think that is the kind of the unifying centerpiece to that work.
Yeah, and I think that brings up an interesting conversation in terms of, not that I have grandchildren, but what is my grandchildren's world going to look like and what are they going to be doing? Same with the great grandchildren, like as we used to think a lot more about that. And I think that's the biggest gap of residential school legacy
Yeah,
is that we were so mindful in thinking about that impact. And now we're kind of more focused on the generations that are kind of here, but how do we take that now and
yeah,
make sure, and that's why I think legacy always comes back
yeah,
with our mediums. How are we going to influence this next generation and following?
yeah,
And how does our art fit into that?
for sure. And I wonder what you think about this, but like I feel in some ways that we're in a moment because of that, because of this legacy of trauma that has happened across generations, that almost like for some just survival is the most that can be thought of. Like, it's almost impossible to think of the next generation because that there has been this long history in certain family lines specifically, right? And um I wonder if I wonder how that changes, right, over time, and if that enfolding of like, I remember somebody who told me, and maybe it was Cherie Dimaline, I think it was probably her, but she was talking about, and maybe she said this to our group when she came to chat, you're holding the hand of the person that came before you, but you're always holding the hand of the person that comes after you. This idea that you're not alone, you're a link in a long chain that goes way, way back, and that's going to go way, way forward. And if a sort of understanding your position there and your responsibilities there, both backward ancestrally to your past and forward to the next generation. So it's like you're living in the moment right now, and we're making work in the moment right now, and we're, doing hopefully really important artistic work that is great and meaningful, but it's always with the thought of the generations that come before, and it's always with the thought of the generations that come after. So it's like working in both directions at the same time. And maybe that's like the ideal place and space, but it's not always possible for every person to be in that space, to be thinking like laterally in both directions. I know for myself, I'm not
Yeah.
always able to do that well. But I think as a value system, that's a grounding place to say, like, let's make our work and our practice built in that.
Yeah, it reminds me actually of one of the elders that I met taking statements because we were worried that we were only getting so much statements. And then there was this pushback from other parts of the population who didn't want to give their statements. And so, I brought that up and he said, well, I'm here for those who can't be here.
Right.
And so basically, if you can be at that table and you can offer that, then you do that work. And that helps those who can't do that work that are in those
Yes.
cycles and who aren't able to contribute because of where they're at their healing journey, wherever they feel. So it made me realize, that because I did have a supportive mom who allowed me to volunteer to do the work, because I could sit at a lot of tables,
Yeah.
I did do that. The problem ended up being was I sat at way too many tables. I was the 4 boards.
Oh
And
gosh.
so it was a little bit too much. So then I realized, okay, now I got to foster future leaders, because I can't just,
Yes,
I'll burn myself if I hold
for
four
sure.
torches.
For sure.
So yeah, how do we spread that out? But it
Yeah.
is kind of what you're saying, for what we can do. And
Yeah.
then, just knowing that at the end of the day, I got to do that self-care as well
Yep.
for myself,
Yep.
because it's hard to do this work and put yourself out there
For
and then
sure.
be the mom that I need to be at the end of the day.
Yep. I think that's the piece of probably also the artistic life as well, as like, and we wear so many hats, right? You wear your own family and personal and friendship and responsibilities, and then your professional responsibilities. And I find at the end of the day, I can be overwhelmed most of the time. And I'm terrible at this is going to sound like an excuse, but it is an excuse. I'm terrible at responding to email because I just feel sometimes overwhelmed by it, like overwhelmed by the people that I have to be present for. Sometimes it's just too much, and I can, in those moments, sometimes I step back from that communication and try to practice some degree of self-care. And sometimes it's sometimes getting outside of my house, getting outside of the city, getting into a natural place to reconnect to what I'm supposed to be doing and who I am and all of those pieces, because it can be a lot. It can be just overwhelming. This life in a really connected world, I think for every person, artist or not, is overwhelming, and we have to care for ourselves as well as the people we have to care for better.
Yeah. Well, definitely. I feel like, yeah, cell phones are there. They make things a little bit easier. We got the emails. We're now all comfortable with working remotely because of the pandemic. But then at the same time, now we have to be more self-aware when we shut things down. So
Yeah.
I was even made aware through my kids how important that was, because they love documentaries. So we would usually sit and watch. But if they
Yeah.
noticed that I was looking at my phone, they would pause it and they would wait for me. And
Good
so
on them.
I realized, okay, it's just a quick email, but that's
Yeah.
not the time. It's after 6. They want to spend time with me.
Yeah.
So now we put our phones aside, and
Good.
that way, while we're watching it, we're there. So now the only danger they have is mom tends to fall asleep in long movies. So that's a different thing. That's a little bit
So,
harder.
oh gosh. Janine, I have to say, like, it is such a joy getting to talk with you, but also what I always think this when, and from the first time I met you, I feel like you are like many, many years my senior, because you just give this wonderful wisdom and advice. And I feel I'm like, gosh, even that, I'm like, that's what a beautiful, beautiful story of like the stories that you've been able to share about your life and your and your life with your sons in particular is just so inspiring. And I'm just like, yeah, that's the kind of dad I want to be. I'm not as good with putting the phone down, but I do see that pull from my children, like, hey dad, I want to spend time. And it's such a precious amount of time. It's so precious little time that we get to spend with them before they're off being adults and living their lives independently, that to cherish those moments and to make them valuable in the post 6 p.m. time of the day. I think that's really important.
Yeah, well, I'm definitely feeling that now. So Delari just turned 18, although he's still got a couple years of his grade 12 year that he's working on.
Yeah.
But just the fact that how fast it came, because it feels like it wasn't that long ago he was that 10-year-old or that he was that baby. So, you trying to work, make a life, career,
Yeah.
and then in terms of like career, I feel pretty good about my life. In
Yeah.
terms of the mom I wanted to be, I think that's where I'm often like, what's that negotiation there? Because,
Mm,
that's where I think I wouldn't say regrets. That's not the right
mm,
word. It's I would have done more in terms of
yeah.
that. But
Yeah.
I also know I needed to take care of them
Yep.
along the way. So Yeah, I think there's a unique dynamic in terms of how we, as Indigenous people, think
Mm,
about our families and our work and that movement back and forth.
absolutely.
Sometimes it's hard to shut it off.
Oh, for sure. And that the pull, the positionality to community too, like being responsible to a community of people, like being accountable to them, but then also being a contributing member to the community. Like I think about that a lot with my home community, because I live away from home. I don't necessarily get to spend a lot of time there. And I have some great reminders of like people doing important work in our community, but it's also something where I'm like, that needs to be enfolded into the work that I do, right? In addition to being a parent, in addition to being a composer or an artist, it's like remembering where you come from, who you're accountable to and responsible to, and how you have to be a contributing member to the community. So that's a piece that I'd like to, as I continue in my 40s, and fold back in.
Yeah.
Better than
But
I'm doing right now.
that's what my mom said, because when I was traveling and doing a lot of that, sometimes I'd be gone for 3 weeks at a time. And she said, it takes a community to raise a child. So while I'm not there,
Absolutely.
she's like, I'm there, your dad's there,
Yeah.
got family around, so to put a little trust and rebuild that kinship in terms of
Yes.
it's okay because we're taking care of our home fires, but we're
Yeah.
also having that circle around them that we know they're okay, even if we're not there.
That's right.
So, yeah.
Oh, so beautiful.
Well,
Oh,
it's been a wonderful hour. I'm just
I,
looking and like, holy time has flew.
oh my gosh, we could talk for like 5 hours, frankly, and I'm sure we would not exhaust subject matters. And also, I love the fact that this has been kind of yes, it's about art and art making, but it's also just about being people. And I think that's probably the most important capture. Hopefully, it's helpful. It's been helpful to those who've listened in.
Wonderful. And yeah, definitely thank you everyone for joining us today to Nagi McWitch. And it's been a wonderful hour and we appreciate your support. And
Thank you
wherever
so
you are,
much,
you
everyone.
have a good night.